All right, so today we are doing a deep dive on, well, one of the most foundational and, most debated topics in Western theology.
Dream atonement. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And our source material for this is a really fascinating, rigorous academic critique. It contrasts penal substitutionary atonement, or PSA, with its own foundational blueprint.
From the Hebrew Bible.
Right. The ritual of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement.
And the argument is pretty sharp.
It really is. Our whole mission here is to unpack this idea that PSA might fundamentally misrepresent God's holiness, by framing it as punitive wrath.
Instead of what the text actually seems to focus on, radical cleansing and reconciliation.
Right? And all comes down to the two goats in Leviticus 16.
Which is where it gets really interesting. But maybe we should quickly define PSA for everyone just to set the stage.
Good call.
Okay, so simply put, PSA asserts that sin creates this infinite penalty.
Eternal death.
Right. And God's justice is this immutable thing that demands this judicial debt be paid. So Christ is punished by the Father.
Receiving the full measure of wrath.
The full measure, exactly. So the core problem being solved is satisfying God's punitive demands.
Okay, so if that's the framework, the substitute must be destroyed to satisfy a legal debt, then what does the biblical paradigm in Yom Kippur actually say atonement is?
Well, it's a completely different focus. The entire Yom Kippur liturgy is centered on cleansing the sanctuary.
The space, not the people's legal status.
Primarily the space, yeah. It's about removing defilement. The Hebrew term is tuma, this ritual contamination.
And the goal is what?
The goal is to purify the space so that a holy God can continue to dwell among a sinful people. The target is the contaminated tabernacle, not just a legal ledger.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for me. The two goats. What is their role in all of this?
Right. So you have the first goat, the one la Yahweh, or for the Lord. And yes, it is sacrifice.
Which is where many would say, see, there's the payment, the punishment.
But this critique argues its blood acts primarily as a purifying agent. Think of it like a spiritual cleaning solution.
So it's used to cleanse the sacred space, to neutralize the contamination.
Exactly. But it's the second goat, the Azazel goat, that directly challenges that entire punitive framework.
Okay, how so?
The priest confesses all the people's sins onto this goat. He literally lays his hands on its head, transferring the guilt.
And then it's led away.
It's led into the wilderness for removal and banishment. And this is the absolute key detail that a lot of people miss.
It's not killed.
It is never punished or slaughtered. Its fate is simply separation. It carries the defilement permanently away from the community.
So you're left with an absolute contradiction.
A total contradiction.
The logic of PSA demands the substitute be executed to exhaust the penalty. But the logic of Yom Kippur requires that the substitute for the removal of sin
must be kept alive and banished to carry that impurity infinitely far away.
And that difference, it profoundly impacts how you view the character of God, doesn't it?
It changes everything. The Yom Kippur model suggests God's holiness is defined by his absolute purity, his ontological incompatibility with defilement.
Not by his need to inflict suffering.
Exactly. Sin isn't a crime needing punishment so much as a contaminant needing removal.
Which makes justice restorative, then. It's about removing the obstacle, the sin and impurity, and restoring the relationship.
Yes. Not about appeasing a furious temper. And notice, God is the one who actively provides the means of cleansing. He's initiating the reconciliation.
So if you connect that to the cross, viewing it through this lens, what does it become?
It becomes a sort of cosmic purification ritual. Christ absorbs and then banishes the defilement of sin, which restores the possibility of God's indwelling presence with humanity. Permanently this time.
It really makes you realize that the most powerful scriptural protest against the necessity of punitive debt, it's the fate of that Azazel goat.
That's a fantastic way to put it.
It's banishment, not execution.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on. If atonement is primarily about permanent cleansing and the removal of defilement, how does that shift your understanding of God's immediate response to human failure?
Today I will address the atonement of cleansing. Why penal substitution is alien to the gospel. For many of us, the doctrine of the atonement is not merely a theological point. It is the absolute heart of our faith, the central mystery of redemption. And yet, because of its centrality, it is a topic that demands not only reverence, but the most rigorous academic and exegetical scrutiny. We must be willing to challenge even our most cherished theological traditions against the bedrock of the divine revelation in Scripture. I want us to spend our time today engaged in exactly this kind of rigorous examination. Our focus is a widely accepted yet deeply problematic theological framework, penal substitutionary atonement, PSA. The core assertion, I will argue, grounding it firmly in the Hebrew Scriptures, is that PSA stands in profound contradiction to the message of atonement illustrated so vividly in the foundational ritual of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and the symbolic action of its two goats. My position is that PSA, in its common formulation, is not merely a strained interpretation, but a distortion, a hermeneutical deviation that fundamentally misrepresents the nature of God's holiness and justice as portrayed in the Old Testament. As you yourself have powerfully noted, it creates a theological necessity that makes God appear primarily wrathful and punitive rather than radically cleansing and reconciling. To guide our discussion, we will proceed in four major movements. First, we will establish an academic, non-pejorative definition of penal substitutionary atonement. Second, we will undertake a deep exegetical dive into Leviticus 16, focusing meticulously on the purpose and actions of the two goats. Third, we will bring the punitive logic of PSA into direct confrontation with the purification logic of Yom Kippur, demonstrating an irreconcilable theological disconnect. Finally, we will consider the critical implications of this contrast for our doctrine of God, theology proper. The anatomy of penal substitutionary atonement. To critique a theological model, we must first define it accurately. Penal substitutionary atonement is a framework designed to explain the necessity and mechanics of Christ's death. It is an elaboration on the substitutionary aspect of the cross. Christ dies in our place. And the judicial aspect of sin. Sin is a legal trespass. As commonly articulated, PSA asserts four core interlocking tenets. A, the problem of infinite offense. The premise begins with the nature of sin. Sin is understood as an offense against the infinite holiness and majesty of God. Because the offended party is infinite, the penalty incurred by the sin must likewise be infinite, eternal death and the full unmitigated expression of God's divine wrath. B, the demand of divine justice. Second, proponents argue that God's justice is an immutable, impersonal requirement. It is a cosmic legal balance that demands that this infinite penalty be paid. God cannot simply forgive sin arbitrarily without compromising his own righteous nature. Therefore, the penalty must be paid either by the sinner in eternal condemnation or by a qualified substitute. C, the act of substitution. Third, Jesus Christ, uniquely qualified as the God-man, willingly steps into the place of humanity. This is the substitutionary element. He takes the legal standing of the sinner upon himself. D, the infliction of punishment. Fourth, and most critical for our debate, God the Father actively punishes the Son on the cross. The Father directs the full measure of his righteous wrath against sin onto the Son, treating him as if he were the summation of human guilt. Christ's suffering is understood as the actual, literal enduring of hell or the legal execution of the sinner's death sentence. The atonement is therefore a judicial transaction focused on satisfying a debt or a sentence of punishment owed to God's justice, resulting in the full exhaustion of God's punitive wrath against those who believe. The primary problem solved by the cross in this view is the necessary satisfaction of God's own righteous, punitive demands. This model has been dominant in Western Protestant thought for centuries, because of its dramatic clarity and its powerful explanation of forensic justification. However, its emphasis on punishment being received fundamentally misreads the primary cultic mechanism that God himself established to define atonement. Second exegetical deep dive, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. We turn now to Leviticus 16, the canonical text that describes the single most important annual religious event for Israel, the ultimate biblical paradigm for Kippur, atonement, covering. This ceremony reveals God's definitive instructional model for how he deals with the problem of sin and defilement within the covenant community. The entire liturgy is focused on securing and maintaining the presence of the holy God, Yahweh, in the midst of a sinful people. If the people's accumulated sin and ritual impurity are allowed to contaminate the tabernacle, God's very presence is threatened and the covenant relationship is broken. The Day of Atonement is the annual repurification and reinstallation of the dwelling. The text is not about satisfying a legal punishment demand, but about cleansing the sanctuary and removing defilement to ensure God can stay. The two goats stand at the center of this purification and removal ritual. A, the goat for the Lord, La Yahweh. The first goat is designated for the Lord. It is sacrificed, and its blood is taken by the high priest Aaron into the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary, a place he is forbidden to enter at any other time. He sprinkles the blood 7 times upon and before the kaporet, the mercy seat, which covers the Ark of the Covenant. The text is utterly clear about the purpose of this action. Thus he shall make atonement for the holy place, because of the uncleanness and transgressions of the people of Israel, whatever their sins. Leviticus 16:16 ESV. Notice the precise terminology and target. The target is the holy place. The atonement is first and foremost for the tabernacle and its furnishings. 16:16, 16:18. It is not primarily for the people as a judicial sentence satisfaction, but for the contaminated space where God dwells. The problem is uncleanness, defilement, tumah. The sin of the people, their tumah, impurity, deposits like a film within the sacred space, making it intolerable for a holy God. The blood is a cleansing agent. The blood of the goat is a life given not as a recipient of punishment, but as a purifying agent used to cleanse the sanctuary from the pollution of sin. The concept is that the blood neutralizes the contamination, thereby securing and restoring God's ability to dwell among his people. The goat's death secures propitiation, the ability to be in the presence of God without being consumed, but it does so through purification and cleansing, not through the Father punishing the victim. The ritual secures a holy dwelling place for God. B, the goat for Azazel, the scapegoat. The second goat is perhaps the most forceful counter-argument to the penal necessity inherent in PSA. This goat, designated for Azazel, a term scholars debate but generally agree, signifies removal to a desolate place, perhaps even a wilderness demon, is not slaughtered. It remains alive. The high priest places both his hands on the goat's head, confessing over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins. Leviticus 16:21. This is a physical, symbolic act of transferring the accumulated defilement onto the animal. Then the goat is led out by a fit man into the wilderness, into an uninhabited, desolate land where it is released, carrying away all their iniquities into a desolate land. Leviticus 16:22. The sin is banished, put at an infinite distance, demonstrating a complete and permanent break from the iniquity. The meaning here is fundamentally about removal and banishment. The goat carries the defilement away from the presence of God and the community, signifying that God is not simply forgiving sin, but radically non-retaining it. Here is the crux of the exegetical argument against PSA. The Azazel goat is never punished. If the central logic of penal substitution were true, that atonement is the absolute non-negotiable satisfaction of a demanded penalty, then this goat would have had to be taken out and killed by the wilderness, or explicitly destroyed in some punitive manner, thereby satisfying the divine punitive demand. But the text is profoundly silent on any punishment. Its fate is simply to be removed and made irrelevant to the community. It is a sign of separation and banishment, not punitive satisfaction. The two goats, working in concert, achieve the full meaning of atonement, purification. The Lord's goat cleanses the sacred space, and removal. The Azazel goat removes the defilement from the people. The entire liturgy focuses on the maintenance of purity and the restoration of God's indwelling presence, never on the judicial execution of a substitute. Third, the contradiction, punishment versus purity. When we place the framework of penal substitutionary atonement directly alongside the biblical paradigm of Yom Kippur, the theological dissonance becomes unmistakable. The difference is one of foundational logic, the logic of penalty versus the logic of purity. A, the difference in the problem solved. The PSA logic defines the central problem as a legal debt or a punitive sentence owed to God's law. The solution is the payment of the penalty through a substitute who receives the wrath. The Yom Kippur logic defines the central problem as ritual defilement, tumah, that compromises God's holy dwelling and breaks the covenant relationship. The solution is the cleansing of the sanctuary and the banishment of the pollution to restore God's presence. B, the difference in the substitute's role. The most damaging contradiction for PSA is the existence of the Azazel goat. In the PSA framework, the substitute must be destroyed, punished, to exhaust the penalty. This is the definition of the penal element. In the Yom Kippur framework, the substitute responsible for removal, the Azazel goat, must be kept alive and banished. Its continued existence in the wilderness is the very guarantee that the sin has been permanently removed and is no longer a liability for the community. Its fate is banishment, not execution. If the biblical illustration of atonement were fundamentally about penal satisfaction, God would not have instituted a ritual where one of the two primary substitutes remains unpunished. The fact that the ultimate act of non-retention is illustrated by a living banished animal fundamentally undermines the argument that the core necessity of atonement is the satisfaction of a punitive demand. The cross, when viewed through the Yom Kippur lens, is not primarily a courtroom execution, but a cosmic purification ritual. Christ, the ultimate high priest and the ultimate sacrifice, does not merely receive punishment. He absorbs and neutralizes the defilement, the goat for the Lord, and then carries that defilement out of existence, the Azazel goat. The cry of dereliction is not necessarily the Father actively punishing the Son, but the Son experiencing the profound existential reality of being sin's total banishment, entering the place of ultimate separation from God's fellowship, the desolate land of Azazel, so that the true holy place, the new creation in the church, can be permanently purified. 4. Theological implications, the character of God. This academic dispute over ritual mechanics has profound implications for our doctrine of God, which brings us directly to your powerful concern about PSA making God seem wrathful. The PSA model creates a necessary distance between God's love and God's justice. In this view, God's wrath is an impersonal, relentless force that must be satisfied. His love is then defined as finding an out, a way to redirect the wrath from the sinner to the Son. The Father, in this scheme, appears as the demanding prosecutor, while the Son is the compassionate defender. This functional division within the Trinity, while usually denied doctrinally, is difficult to avoid psychologically for those embracing a strict PSA. It portrays the Father as a figure whose primary response to humanity's fall is retributive fury. The Yom Kippur model presents an alternative, covenantal and relational view of God's justice and holiness. Holiness as purity, not vengeance. God's holiness is defined not by a need to inflict suffering, but by his absolute purity and his ontological incompatibility with defilement. When God reacts to sin, it is not merely retributive rage, but a sorrowful necessity that his absolute purity cannot abide the pollution. God does not demand payment, a debt of suffering. He demands perfection, a restoration of purity. The only way a holy God can dwell among unholy people is for the unholiness to be perfectly dealt with. Justice as restorative, not punitive. In this lens, justice is defined by the preservation of the covenant relationship. When sin compromises that relationship, justice requires the removal of the obstacle, sin and impurity, and the restoration of the sacred space. The Day of Atonement is God's initiative to overcome the barrier of defilement to dwell with humanity. It is not the appeasement of his own furious temper. God as the reconciler, not the offended party. The entire Yom Kippur ritual is instituted by Yahweh, the God who seeks to reconcile. He provides the means, the instruction, and the paradigm. The work of Christ is therefore best understood as God in Christ reconciling the world to himself, 2 Corinthians 5:19, rather than Christ reconciling the Father to the world. The Father is not the one who must be convinced. He is the one who provides the means of cleansing. When we declare that penal substitutionary atonement is a heresy, meaning a selection of truths divorced from the larger context that distorts the divine nature, it is because the focus on penalty obscures the deeper, more profound truth of purification and covenant restoration so vividly displayed in the Levitical ritual. The truth is that God's justice is not primarily satisfied by pain, but by perfect cleansing and the permanent removal of sin's power and presence. The cross achieved this purification and removal in a way that the two goats could only prefigure. The biblical message of atonement is a profound expression of God's commitment. I will remove the sin from the midst of you, and I will dwell in the midst of you. This is the triumph of the cross and the deeper truth concealed by the punitive framework of PSA. The fate of the Azazel goat, banishment not punishment, remains the enduring scriptural protest against the claim that atonement's primary necessity is the satisfaction of a punitive legal debt. It is a sign of radical forgiveness and non-retention, a testament to a God whose holiness compels cleansing, whose justice compels restoration, and whose love compels permanent reconciliation. I thank you for your attention to this crucial theological distinction, and I hope this challenge to the prevailing model of PSA encourages you to ground all your future explorations of Christ's work firmly in the purification and removal logic of the biblical Day of Atonement.